Hello, and welcome to another episode of Save the Social Worker podcast, a place where we look at how social workers can uncover their fullest potential. Today we talk with Ting, a PhD researcher and someone who writes regularly at his blog socialservice.sg. Hello, Ting, welcome, and thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. So, do you want to tell some of our listeners more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. I am Ting Yao. I am a PhD candidate in UCLA, majoring in social welfare. Broadly, I'm really interested in issues that are related to inequality and poverty, especially working with youth and adolescents from low-income families. And in particular, my current dissertation, which is my main focus right now, looks at and considers social capital and well-being of low-income single-parent families in Singapore. Yeah, and of course, in my free time, I also run socialservice.sg, which is a website that's dedicated to social service research, and I also run the podcast. So that's kind of my way of trying to bridge research and practice in more concerted efforts. Yeah.
So you write a blog and a podcast. Can you tell me more about what started you to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I started blogging when I was in junior college. See, that's 2009. That was 11 years ago. So I started blogging then, and I also started writing letters to the newspapers. So this is this idea of being engaged in social, political, economic issues and writing about these issues. And over the years since 2009, in addition to my own website and blog, I wrote for now defunct sites, but Breakfast Network in 2013, The Middle Ground in 2015, and also for MVPC, they had a publication called Salt back in 2014. So I've been writing about these, and the transition to socialservice.sg was really kind of like a convergence with my own research. So it became something that was an extension of what I was doing in my day job. And so of concern with socialservice.sg is this kind of what I term as the last mile translation from research to practice. It is also this idea where we wanted to conduct social service research with the practitioners in mind, with social workers in mind. So the common challenge here is that researchers often, publish findings in journals which are paywalled. No one really checks on the lives of the beneficiaries. We go into an agency, we in a way extract information from the individuals or even the social workers. So I guess this small step is to translate these findings into things that can actually be used by social workers or social work or social service practitioners who should not, I think, in my mind, be bystanders in the research process.
Okay. So, thanks for sharing more about that. So it's really interesting how you focus on the last mile translation and application for the social service professional. I mean, do you think there are some problems with that currently with the research field?
I think the problem, and I can speak for this because I think I speak as an academic or aspiring academic. I think most of the problems don't lie with social workers themselves, as in a lot of problems systematically lie with how academia and research is set up to incentivize a particular way of knowledge production, right? So researchers are incentivized to get data, to publish in journals, to go for conferences, and a lot of the benefits don't accrue to the social workers or the social service agencies. And so that's a gap that I think falls upon academics and researchers, not so much social workers themselves. So what this means is that academics need to be cognizant of this fact. That's the first step. And then the second step is, how do we then move into a mode where we actually collaborate and work with social service agencies and social workers rather than just take information from them and leave with it, So that collaboration process has to be much more fleshed out than it currently is at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for sharing that side of how research and academia is incentivized. I mean, how about as social workers? I mean, just now you mentioned that we shouldn't be bystanders in this research process, but I mean, what more can we do?
I mean, we are in a pretty unique time in the sense of like, there are plenty of resources out there. Yes, there are academic journal articles that are still paywall, and there needs to be that translation, that last mile effort. But I think there are a few things that are coming up that can be, um, you know, that we can kind of like pay attention to. I mean, the first one is to follow resources, right? So the NUS Social Service Research Center has a fantastic snippet that I think they publish every quarter. And so these are insights that are gathered very much from social service practitioners. And they have a Facebook page. In fact, during this COVID time as well, they have been religiously publishing on a week-to-week basis what social workers have been experiencing. So this is informed by insights from social workers. So social workers talk about, or they fill in a survey anonymously about what the experiences has been through the COVID period, what interactions have been like with families. And so a very big first step would be following resources like this. The other bit I think which would be helpful is to pay more attention to what is broadly termed as macro social work. So I think most, if not all, of social workers who are trained in Singapore are fantastic at micro social work. So in terms of how do we deliver, I shouldn't say we, but how do you deliver interventions on the ground, working with families, working with the disadvantaged and the marginalized. I don't think there's any issue with that in terms of the training, but I think it doesn't hurt to pay a bit more attention to macro social work. So that means paying attention to social economic issues. Doesn't mean you have to be political or take a stance with political issues, especially with election. That doesn't mean it. It means paying attention to maybe what the policies are and what the issues are and how that might systematically affect the beneficiaries, the clients with whom you work, right? And of course, I think the first one is about following resources. Second, about paying attention to macro social work. I think another point is building coalitions and communities. This is a pretty famous, not metaphor, but kind of like anecdote that the comedian Conan O'Brien, which I follow, he says this idea of like following your tribe. So this idea of finding your crowd or your tribe with whom you can talk about. So reading is one thing and understanding is one thing, but it always helps if you can find individuals in the social work space who deal with these things, right? So if you can talk to people about it. And in this vein, I like to kind of problematize what academics are doing. So I feel like, academics can also help set the stage for engagement, right? Having these platforms for collaboration and building coalitions, that would go a very long way, because that's where I think academics and researchers can be helpful.
Thanks so much for those points. I think it's really useful to think about how we can be more engaged in the process of research. So as a social worker, I think many of our concerns are around how we don't necessarily have enough time to catch up with the latest research. How would you respond to that?
I mean, the time thing, it's fair, right? Because the thing about time is that you will probably be able to speak to it as a social worker. I imagine your work is focused on helping individuals and families, and so a lot of your work has to do with direct micro social work, and that's important. That's a pretty important function of the profession. I think in terms of having no time, in addition to what I said just now, following resources, I think it's also developing kind of like a habit in terms of focusing on things that interest you. So there's no point following something if you're asked to do it, right? Let's say you're sent to. That's the reason why, if you're compelled or forced to go for training or exercises, that might not excite you as much because you didn't choose to go for that particular training or exercise, right? Whereas if you're given some autonomy in terms of like focusing on something that really excites you, right? So you might work with, for instance, if I work with low-income single-parent families, then I want to know, what are people talking about low-income single-parent families in the scene, right? And, how are people dealing with it? What are the lived experiences of the individuals? What's the latest research, not just in Singapore, but also in the region or even around the world. So keeping plugged in that sense by focusing on something that's specific to your expertise or specific to something that's of interest to you, I think that will help.
So, I'm hearing that we as social workers should begin to spend more time pursuing actually what excites us and what we are passionate about. I mean, within the field, I've often heard practitioners saying that theory is something that you can throw out the window after university. And I think some of it refutes the sentiment that theory and research isn't necessarily directly applicable to the ground. Is that something you notice, and how you respond to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, research and theory are not mutually exclusive. Like, to do research, you need theory, right? As in, whether inductively or deductively, theory is at the center of it. And so any research endeavor or any attempt at, engaging in research at the social service, social work level would require comprehension of theory. I think theory probably gets a bad rep because of, I guess, readings which are esoteric or dense. But I think there's value in it. I mean, the two theories that I'm most familiar with are the ecological framework, which all social workers know, and then social capital theory, which social workers are familiar with as well. I like to explain it in the sense of, like, if I relate these two theories and apply it to the context of the use and adolescents with whom I work, then it becomes much more clear. Because what is ecological theory and why is it important? It's important because it helps us understand the supposed microsystems, essentially asking the question, who are the individuals and who are the important significant others or family and non-family individuals that youth engage with. And this gives us a framework. We are looking at schools, the home, the family, and then the neighborhoods and communities. And theory gives us a conceptual kind of framework and perspective to identify these things. And then what social capital? What social capital are resources that are embedded in relationships. And so when we put these two together, then using social capital is a way to understand how use accrue, certain resources from family and non-family individuals, right? So that's the two theories that I engage in. Now, in a broader sense, theory is gaining more and more kind of like popularity in Singapore as well. I mean, I'm thinking of an example where Dr. Ong Tian and Dr. Neil Yu Wei of the NUS Social Service Research Center, which I talked about just now, have been or documented how FSC social workers approach discretionary financial assistance, which is supposedly tied to perceptions of low-income clients. Now, this is a micro-social work endeavor, right? In the sense of how do you decide, how do you exercise discretion, and should I give financial assistance to this family or not? How do I make that decision? But then in the recent publication from the symposium last year, they had two kind of like broad perspectives, right? They talked about one dominant theoretical discourse about tough love, which is, how do we activate service users or individuals to give their best and become independent? And they contrast this tough love discourse with bleeding hearts discourse, which is, as I quote, shifting attention to conditions that individuals in poverty might face. Things like, as they point out, wage stagnation or unfair employment practices. And so these are theories, right? The theories of tough love and bleeding hearts. But when you start to apply them into everyday contexts where they are actually being in action, then that brings kind of like not just awareness, but brings a certain degree of engagement with these theories. And you realize that it's not just that theory is very much a central nexus of research, but theory informs every part of social work practice as well. And I'm just only brushing the surface. We can go and talk about how theory informs design of interventions. Why do we think there's a causal mechanism? And by causal mechanism, and simply put, how do we know, or why do we think that this intervention, this counseling session would improve the condition or improve the predisposition of the client? There is a theory behind it, because research supposedly has shown that if counseling is approached in this particular manner, these are the kind of like mechanisms through which it will enable certain behaviors or changes. So, it's not just research which relies very heavily on theory. Practice itself relies very heavily on theory. We don't see it, but when we bring it up and, activate it, I think that's where we see its value.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this idea that actually theory informs a lot more of the social workers' work than we are aware of is actually quite important. And actually, as we move forward from here, I mean, do you think there are certain shifts in attitudes that social workers need to take towards research?
I mean, that's entirely, I'm not gonna, it sounds like I'm not answering your question right away. I think it ultimately depends on the individual social workers and social work agencies. If you're asking for my opinion in terms of how important it is, I think it's important because at a very broad level, I think research and theory, they guide our work, they guide our frames of reference. And I think what's most important in these exercises in any profession is engagement and research and theory, and these forms of exercises forces us to be more reflective. And that's important because in any profession, the only way to get better is to be reflective and understand where we might have gone wrong and gone right. And so not objectively, but the more objective way of doing it is, I think, through research. And in terms of how we can shift attitudes towards research, I think maybe three things. I think the first would be, and speaking as a researcher and academic, I think asking more of researchers and academics. So asking more from them and not having them just take advantage of social work organizations and agencies in terms of just extracting information. So expecting and asking of researchers and academics to be more involved in the design of the project and involving social work and social work practitioners, especially those who are interested. So, that's asking more of academics and researchers. I think the second is seeing research and especially data collection, right? More precisely, data collection as a everyday endeavor. It's not, it's useful in terms of pragmatically to think of research as like a project. We do this evaluation project, we move on to the next project, we move on to this next project. There's nothing wrong with it, but really, I think research is an everyday endeavor because it's tied to what I just mentioned, which is there's this reflective and reflexive exercise where we keep thinking about, how did this go? How did the session go? How did this intervention go? And a reason why I mentioned data collection is that a lot of time in research is spent on data collection. Of course, research questions, which we'll talk about, but data collection takes up a lot of time. And so if you're mindful of what research you're engaged in, then you can be more mindful of how to collect data. And once you have that mindset, it's much easier when the time comes and you have to do a project to actually go about with the data collection and analysis subsequently. And then I think the third one and final point, which is tied to data collection, is know your research question. The question here is not about, should I do quantitative surveys or should I do qualitative interviews? That's not the question to ask. The question here is, what is the research question that you're interested in? I go with the social service agencies I work with. The first question I ask them is, what are the needs of the organization? It's not about what I want to do as a researcher. It's about what the needs that the organization has and what the needs of the individuals might be. And so with that as a starting point, then it becomes figuring out if those are your needs, then can we craft a research question from there? And once we have a research question, then we'll be better informed to know what the research methods are and how we approach with the collection of data, with the analysis, and so on and so forth. So those three things, right? And I think if you're asking me in terms of prioritization, I think it's in that order, really asking more of, in the Singapore context, researchers and academics to do much more for social service agencies and practitioners.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think there's lots more as a social worker that I can do in getting involved with the research process. As we prepare to wrap up this interview, are there certain things that I haven't asked that you'd like to talk about?
The final thing I would say is the C word, which is collaboration, right? I talked briefly about building coalitions, like quoting Conan about how finding a tribe is important. I think those informal networks are important. I think the challenge right now is for individuals who are passionate and interested in this field to actually get together. So I wish, and I think hopefully this is something that we can more than advocate and work towards, which is, a community that involves social service researchers who are there as resource partners, and then individuals from social service agencies and volunteers and whoever is interested in this endeavor to be involved in the same community, so that when there's a need to activate certain resources or projects, you can easily match those you can actually build those partnerships and match those needs on a much more efficient manner. We don't quite have that now, as in I wish we saw more of that. There are probably formal partnerships between agencies facilitated by different agencies, which is great, but I think there is a lot more that can be done in terms of the collaboration piece.
Okay, sure. So this gap in collaboration and bringing together professional researchers and practitioners and people who are interested is something that you see as a gap.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not easy gap because even within academia itself, how do you bridge people working in different disciplines? And you will see that
Mm,
mirror in the social service space. How do you bring together someone like me who works with youth and adolescents and families with someone who works maybe in the disability space or someone who works in elder care? Now, these are conventional kind of like categories that we've adhered to. In reality, is it's really learning how to break down these barriers, right? To work in an interdisciplinary manner. Because
yeah.
who is to say that I can't work with someone who works with elder care? Because we're interested in the family unit. So we can look at the life cost. And again, we
Mm,
talked about theories, right? Life cost perspective is one that sees development as not confined to particular phases in life. Yes, it's more poignant in adolescence and childhood, but development happens across lifespan, life
yeah.
course, right? So,
Okay.
and families are multi-generation now, right? So the interactions between the grandparents and grandkids and with parents. So, studying these family dynamics doesn't just require someone who specializes, I would think, in youth and adolescent research like myself, but also should involve individuals who work with elderly Singaporeans and grandparents. So the same can be said
Mm,
of social service agencies. Doesn't mean collaboration should be confined to, hey, you're FSC, I work with FSC. Hey, you are a youth agency, I work with you because I'm a youth agency, youth
yeah.
agency as well.
Yeah.
Why can't we work on the basis of issues rather than, beneficiaries along
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
family violence, domestic violence? There are actually coalitions like that. I think in one of my podcasts, sorry, not podcast, in a webinar I moderated, Aware mentioned that there's actually a coalition that is geographical, which talks about domestic violence, but they can be expanded, right, by issues rather than um, by beneficiaries strictly. So I think that that's going to be a way in which collaboration can be crafted. And I mean, if I may, a final point,
Mm,
which is going to be challenging. I think this is something, John, we talked about before, which is how do we learn to center the experiences, the lived experiences of the individuals and communities with whom we work. So it's great to
mm,
hear from academics, researchers, even social workers, right? Because
mm,
in a way, we're intermediaries. We can tell their stories, but who better to tell these stories than the individuals and communities themselves? The problem
mm,
here is that most platforms and channels are not designed in a way to elicit that form of perspectives from these communities and individuals. If they are included in a webinar, it's very hard to run away from the dangers of stereotyping and objectifying the experience.
mm,
Crudely speaking, it's like the metaphor of you're just putting someone like a zoo exhibit. You're going to a zoo, you see someone's experience and you're documenting it. That's helpful, right? You learn more about, in the zoo example, conservation, you learn about poverty by hearing from someone. But what better way than to actually hear from these individuals themselves? And the role of academics, researchers, slash social workers is to design these spaces to allow for these voices and perspectives to come. And we
mm.
haven't seen that quite yet. So that I think ties in with collaboration, because that will be a form of how collaboration looks like in the future.
Okay. So giving a space to the clients and also bringing clients, the practitioners and the researchers together to collaborate on making this research space more accessible to all.
Yeah, I mean, accessibility, accessibility in the sense of like actually, so two ways: engaging the individuals and communities directly. So
Mm-hmm.
engaging them as active agents, not participants. And then on the other hand, being able to disseminate this message and these insights to a wider audience. Right.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
those are the two ways I think will be important.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Jin Yao. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
No problem. I think we should have not just you, but I mean we should have more conversations like this. Not just
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
research, but on in the social work, social service space. This deserves a lot more emphasis and focus, and hopefully, in the aftermath of the general election, however it goes, we'll be able to focus on that thereafter. Yeah,
Yeah. Sure. Thank you so much, Jin Yao.
no problem. Thank you.
Thank you.